The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I clocked in for my first solo night shift at the city morgue. I'd always been able to stomach hospitals and, well, places like this. Death didn't scare me, at least, that's what I told myself. But tonight felt different. The cold seeped into my skin as I walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to the morgue's main room, where Lyle, the day attendant, was waiting. "You must be David," he said, looking me over with tired eyes that hinted at too many hours spent in a place like this. "First night, huh?" I nodded, trying to ignore the slight unease building in my gut. "Yeah, just here to study and keep an eye on things. You know, easy shift." Lyle raised an eyebrow, an amused grin tugging at his lips. "You keep telling yourself that, kid. But do yourself a favor." He leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "Keep an eye on drawer 47. I laughed nervously, figuring he was trying to mess with the newbie. "What's with drawer 47? "Let's just say it doesn't always stay shut," Lyle replied, his face dead serious. He handed me the keys and a logbook, patting me on the shoulder as he passed. "Good luck." With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet, sterile stillness of the morgue. I took a deep breath and sat up at the small desk near the drawers, pulling out my notes and settling into study. But every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the rows of drawers against the wall, particularly the one labeled 47. I shook my head, laughing at myself. I'd been here all of 15 minutes, and already Lyle's warning was getting to me. The hours passed slowly, broken only by the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. Around midnight, as I was deep in my notes, I heard a faint, scratching sound. I froze, the pen in my hand hovering above the paper. The sound was coming from across the room, where the drawers lay in shadow. Probably just the air system, I told myself. Old buildings made noises. I forced myself to relax and continued reading. But the sound came again, louder this time, a soft, dragging scratch, like fingernails against metal. My heart pounded as I got up, walking slowly toward the source of the noise. I stopped in front of drawer 47, staring at it, half expecting it to spring open. But it remained shut, cold and silent. I was just about to turn back when something caught my eye. The drawer wasn't fully closed. It was open by the slightest crack, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. A chill ran down my spine. "Okay, Lyle," I muttered under my breath, hoping he was hiding somewhere, waiting to jump out and scare me. But there was no one. Just me and the dead silence of the morgue. I steeled myself and reached out, pulling the drawer fully open. Inside lay the body of an elderly man, covered in a white sheet, hands crossed over his chest in an oddly formal position. His face was drawn and pale, with a strange peace about it, yet something about his expression seemed off. It was as if he had been frozen mid-thought, his mouth slightly open, his eyes shut but not fully at rest. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself that it was just a body. Nothing more. With a final glance, I pushed the drawer shut and returned to my desk, feeling the silence press down on me like a weight. I tried to focus on my notes, but my eyes kept darting to drawer 47. It was ridiculous, I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 3 a.m., just as I was beginning to feel the weight of fatigue, I heard it again, the soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across metal. My heart skipped a beat. This time, it was unmistakable. The sound was coming from drawer 47. I stood, frozen, my eyes locked on the drawer as the scraping grew louder, more insistent. I told myself it was impossible, that it had to be some kind of ventilation issue, or maybe a loose drawer. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The drawer was moving. Just barely, but enough for me to see, a subtle shift, like it was being pulled from the inside. I backed up, my breath catching in my throat as the drawer inched open. A wave of icy air washed over me, and in the dim light, I could see the man's hand, a bony, pale hand, lying just on the edge of the drawer, as if reaching out. A chill spread through me as I realized the hand had moved. It hadn't been there before. I took another step back, heart racing, and stumbled, knocking over my chair. The noise broke the spell, and I scrambled to my feet, breathing hard. I forced myself to walk back to the drawer, half expecting the body to sit up, to open its eyes and look at me. But when I reached the drawer, everything was still. The hand was back in its original position, crossed over his chest as if nothing had happened. I closed the drawer firmly, trying to steady my breathing, and backed away. Maybe Lyle was right. Maybe there was something about drawer 47, something I wasn't ready to understand. As I returned to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the morgue, eyes were watching me from the shadows. And as I sat down, the room grew colder, the silence thick and heavy, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper. "Stay with me." I spent the next few hours in a state of tense vigilance, my eyes flickering constantly back to drawer 47, half expecting it to open on its own again. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a draft, or an old mechanism in need of repair. But a nagging fear took root, deep and insistent, whispering that there was more to this drawer than I could explain. Around 4 a.m., just as my adrenaline began to fade and fatigue threatened to take over, the lights flickered, casting the room into brief shadows. In the flash of darkness, I thought I saw something, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing by the drawer. I blinked, and the light steadied, revealing only the empty, sterile room. "Get it together, David," I muttered, forcing myself to look away. I'd been awake for too long, and the morgue's eerie quiet was getting to me. But no sooner had I tried to focus back on my work than the unmistakable sound returned. It was the same faint, dragging scrape, echoing through the silence. My hands shook as I stood and turned to face drawer 47. It was ajar again, slightly more open than before. My stomach twisted. I hadn't touched it since I'd closed it hours ago. I approached slowly, my heart pounding with each step. The drawer's metal handle glinted under the harsh fluorescent light, and as I got closer, I could see the body within, lying perfectly still. But something was different. The man's hands had moved. Instead of lying peacefully over his chest, they were now resting at his sides, fingers splayed as though he'd been trying to push the drawer open from the inside. Every rational thought fled as I stared at the body, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation. I hadn't touched him, hadn't opened the drawer since the last time I'd checked. And yet, his hands lay differently, frozen in that eerie position. My first instinct was to close the drawer again, to lock it and never open it. But something stopped me, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was soft, coming from within the drawer, barely louder than a breath, but unmistakably there. "Help me." I stumbled back, my skin crawling. The whisper was weak, almost a sigh, but it was real. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked down at the drawer, paralyzed by the horror of what I'd just heard. I wanted to run, to leave the morgue and never look back, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. "Help me." The voice came again, soft and pleading, as though the man within the drawer were somehow still alive, trapped in a state between life and death. I leaned closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand, my mind clouded with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Who are you?" I whispered, half expecting silence. But instead, the whisper grew louder, more desperate. "Let me out." I yanked the drawer open, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I saw movement, the man's fingers twitching, his head turning ever so slightly. But as I blinked, the illusion vanished, leaving only the still, lifeless body. The room fell silent again, thick with an oppressive tension that pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I forced myself to take a step back, my mind reeling. My gaze darted to the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell me this was all some cruel prank. Just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. I fumbled to answer, grateful for any distraction. David? It's Lyle. His voice was calm, almost too calm. How's your first night going? I opened my mouth to tell him everything, to demand to know if he'd set this up somehow. But the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to tell him about the whispers, the strange movements, the feeling that something was watching me. It's fine, I lied, forcing my voice to stay steady. There was a pause on the other end, a silence heavy with unspoken words. Then, Lyle's voice dropped to a whisper. Drawer 47. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. What about it? He sighed, the sound filled with something that almost resembled pity. Just, don't look inside too long. That drawer has a way of pulling people in. What do you mean? I demanded, the words spilling out in a rush. What's wrong with it? But Lyle had already hung up, leaving me alone with the silence. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Lyle knew something he wasn't telling me. My hand clenched around the phone as I looked back at drawer 47, my mind teetering on the edge of reason. For the rest of the night, I kept my distance, sitting as far from drawer 47 as possible, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the dawn. Every sound, every flicker of the lights sent a jolt of terror through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the whisper hadn't been my imagination. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I gathered my things, ready to leave the morgue behind. But as I turned to go, a faint noise caught my attention. The drawer was ajar again, just enough to reveal the man's pale hand, resting in an open, grasping position, as though he'd reached out one last time. Without a backward glance, I bolted for the door, leaving the morgue behind, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't explain. But even as I left, the whisper echoed in my mind, soft and pleading, a promise I couldn't ignore. Let me out. I barely slept the day after my first shift at the morgue. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, the faint whisper, soft but insistent, pleading for release. By the time the sun set, I found myself pacing my apartment, my mind caught between dreading my next shift and the nagging pull to go back. Despite everything, a part of me needed to understand what was happening. When I arrived at the morgue that night, Lyle was waiting for me outside, his expression unusually serious. He looked me up and down, taking in my pale face and the exhaustion in my eyes. You saw something, didn't you? He asked, his tone cautious. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Finally, I nodded. Drawer 47, something isn't right about it. I heard whispers. Lyle's face darkened, and he looked away, his hand resting on the morgue door. I figured as much. I should have warned you better. You see, drawer 47 is different. We don't talk about it much because, well, people wouldn't believe it. But some say that the souls of the restless find their way into that drawer, drawn by something they left unfinished. Are you saying it's haunted? I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Lyle met my eyes, his gaze heavy with something that looked like regret. I don't know if it's haunted or cursed, but I do know that everyone who's worked here has experienced something unsettling. Whispers, movements, shadows. They call it the last watch. Those who linger in the drawer aren't ready to leave this world. They're holding on. A chill ran down my spine as his words sank in. What am I supposed to do? Just remember this, Lyle said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Whatever you do, don't answer them. And if you hear your name, run. With that, he handed me the keys and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the cold night air. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped inside. The morgue was as silent as ever, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I tried to focus on my tasks, ignoring drawer 47, telling myself that it was just a drawer, just a body. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the silence grew, pressing down on me like a weight. Hours passed, and as the clock struck midnight, I heard it, the faint scrape of metal, the soft sigh of something shifting in the darkness. My heart pounded as I looked up, my gaze drawn inevitably to the row of drawers. Drawer 47 was open. This time, the drawer was pulled out completely, and the man's face was visible, his eyes closed, his expression almost peaceful. But his hands were different. They were positioned on either side of the drawer, as though he tried to push himself upright. I took a shaky step forward, my hand reaching for my phone. My instincts screamed at me to run, to leave the morgue and never look back. But then I heard it again, a voice, soft and familiar. "David." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice had said my name. I turned slowly, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I looked around the empty room. But there was no one there, just the rows of drawers and the quiet hum of the lights. "David." The whisper was louder now, filled with a desperate, pleading tone. I backed away, my gaze locked on the drawer, every fiber of my being screaming to leave. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity mixed with a sense of dread. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was a pause, a silence so thick it felt like the room was holding its breath. And then, the voice replied. "I don't remember." The answer sent a chill through me, and I took another step back, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was dealing with, whether it was a ghost, a memory, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear, it wasn't going to let me go. The lights flickered, casting the room into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment. And in that darkness, I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. It was the man from drawer 47, his hollow eyes fixed on me, his expression empty and unreadable. When the lights came back on, he was gone, and the drawer was closed. I staggered back, my heart racing, my mind teetering on the edge of panic. I wanted to leave, to escape this nightmare, but the voice echoed in my mind, soft and insistent, pulling me back. "David, don't leave." I bolted, grabbing my things and rushing out of the morgue, leaving the eerie silence behind. But as I stepped into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the shadows were watching, waiting for the next time I would come back. And in the stillness, I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind, a promise I couldn't ignore. "I'll be here, waiting." The next night, I almost called in sick. Every nerve in my body screamed to stay away from the morgue, to leave that place and never look back. But something stronger, maybe curiosity, maybe defiance, drove me back. I had to understand what was happening, to know if I was losing my mind or if drawer 47 truly held something beyond the grave. As I entered the morgue, the familiar coldness settled over me, more oppressive than before. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the rows of drawers and equipment. I set my bag down and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The place was as empty and silent as ever, but I could feel an energy lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. I began my shift with routine tasks, forcing myself to focus on anything but drawer 47. But as the hours crept by, the silence seemed to thicken, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel eyes watching me, an invisible presence lingering just out of sight. Around midnight, the lights flickered, casting the room into brief shadows. My heart pounded as I looked toward drawer 47, half expecting to see it ajar. But it remained closed, silent and undisturbed. Relief washed over me, and I laughed at myself, feeling foolish. "Get a grip, David," I muttered, shaking my head. It was just an old morgue, nothing more. But then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. My stomach dropped, and I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The sound grew louder, echoing through the silence, and then it stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 The sound was coming from the direction of drawer 47. My hands trembled as I approached the drawer, every instinct screaming for me to turn back. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see. I reached out, gripping the handle, and pulled the drawer open. The body lay inside, as still and lifeless as ever, but something was different. A piece of paper was tucked beneath the man's hand, barely visible against the stark white sheet. I hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to stop me, then reached down and pulled it free. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges frayed, but the words scrawled across it were clear. "Stay with me." A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled back, dropping the note as though it burned my skin. The message was a demand, a plea, filled with a desperation that cut through the silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, casting the room into darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited, paralyzed by fear. And then, in the dim glow of the emergency lights, I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, just barely visible in the shadows. It was the man from drawer 47, his hollow eyes fixed on me, his expression empty yet somehow filled with an intense longing. His body was contorted, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if he tried to rise but had been stopped halfway. "David." The whisper filled the room, soft and haunting, echoing in the silence. I backed away, my heart racing, but the figure took a step forward, moving slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving mine. "Stay with me." I stumbled, my back hitting the cold metal drawers behind me, trapping me between them and the figure. My mind raced, and I remembered Lyle's warning, his final words before he'd left me alone with the dead. "Don't answer them." I clamped my mouth shut, resisting the urge to scream, to beg, to do anything that would break the silence. But the figure kept advancing, closing the distance between us, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. Just as he was within arm's reach, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in harsh, sterile light. The figure was gone, leaving only the empty drawers and the faint hum of the fluorescent bulbs. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with relief and terror. But as I caught my breath, I realized something chilling. The drawer was open. Drawer 47 lay empty, the body gone, as though it had never been there at all. I staggered to my feet, backing away from the drawer, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I'd seen, whether it was real, or a product of my exhausted mind. But one thing was clear, the morgue wasn't safe. Not for me, and not for anyone who stayed too long. Without a second thought, I grabbed my things and left, barely pausing to lock the door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a shock as I stepped outside, but even the bitter wind couldn't chase away the lingering feeling of eyes watching me, of a presence that wouldn't let me go. As I walked to my car, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper carried on the wind, soft but unmistakable. "Stay with me." The following day, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. "Stay with me," the words echoed in my mind, clinging to my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the exhaustion of working night shifts had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew the truth, something unnatural was tied to drawer 47, something that wanted me to stay. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was a nervous wreck, glancing over my shoulder as if expecting the figure to appear in broad daylight. But when I reached the morgue, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever, the silence thick and oppressive. I set my bag down and began my shift as usual, pretending that nothing had changed, that everything was normal. But my eyes kept drifting to drawer 47, the empty space where the body should have been. The memory of that hollow-eyed figure lingered, his words etched into my mind like a brand. Around midnight, the silence broke. I was sitting at my desk, trying to distract myself with paperwork, when I heard it, the faint scrape of metal, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from drawer 47. I stood, my heart racing, every muscle in my body tense. But instead of fear, a strange sense of determination filled me. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't keep running from whatever haunted this place. I approached the drawer, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The tapping grew louder as I neared, each sound a reminder of the figure's plea, his desperate call for me to stay. When I reached the drawer, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. But before I could pull it open, a voice broke the silence, low and filled with warning. "Don't." I turned, heart pounding, and saw Lyle standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, as though he knew exactly what I was going through. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. Lyle's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his eyes fixed on drawer 47. "That's how it starts," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "The whispers, the movements, it draws you in, little by little, until you can't leave. I've seen it happen before." What is it?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. Lyle looked away, his jaw tight. "They call it, the last watch. It's as if the souls of the dead find a way to linger, trapped between worlds, unable to move on. And sometimes, they reach out, hoping to find someone willing to stay, someone to share their fate." A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back, my eyes darting between Lyle and drawer 47. "You're saying, he wants me to stay?" Lyle nodded slowly, his face etched with sorrow. "You're not the first. And you won't be the last. But if you want to survive, you have to ignore him. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't respond. And whatever you do, don't open the drawer again." I swallowed hard, my mind racing with questions. What if he doesn't stop? What if he keeps following me? Lyle's gaze turned cold, and he placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Then you do what I did. You leave. For good." With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with the silence and the growing sense of dread. His words echoed in my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. I knew he was right, I had to leave. But something about the drawer, about the figure's desperate whisper, held me back, a dark curiosity that refused to let go. The rest of the night passed in a haze, every sound amplified, every shadow seeming to stretch and move in the corner of my vision. I stayed as far from drawer 47 as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me, of a presence lingering just out of sight. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep into the room, I gathered my things, ready to leave and never look back. But as I reached the door, a soft sound stopped me, a whisper, faint and pleading. "David." I froze, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding. The whisper was weaker than before, filled with a sadness that cut through the silence like a knife. "Please, stay." A chill ran down my spine, and I tightened my grip on the door, forcing myself not to turn back. But as I stepped outside, the voice echoed one last time, a promise that filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. "I'll be waiting." I didn't return to the morgue for a week. Every night, I lay awake, haunted by the whisper, by the memory of that pale figure reaching out from drawer 47. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, I could still hear his voice, soft, pleading, as though he were waiting just outside my door. On the 8th night, a call from the hospital jolted me from my restless sleep. They were short-staffed, the caller explained, and they needed me to cover the shift. Despite every instinct screaming at me to refuse, I found myself agreeing. Something compelled me to go back, an invisible pull I couldn't resist. When I arrived, the morgue was empty, and the familiar cold settled over me like a shroud. I set my bag down, feeling the weight of the silence press in, thicker than ever. The room felt darker, as if the shadows had grown, stretching and shifting in the corners of my vision. I knew I shouldn't be there. But something, curiosity, fear, a sense of unfinished business, drove me toward drawer 47. The drawer was closed, its metal handle glinting in the faint light, innocent and undisturbed. But as I approached, a chill washed over me, and I felt a presence lurking just out of sight. The shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in around me, and then I heard it, a whisper, soft and pleading, filled with a desperation that made my skin crawl. "David, you came back. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I listened, every nerve on edge. The voice was close, too close, as if it were right behind me. But when I turned, the room was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the lights. I knew you'd return. The voice came again, softer, filled with a sense of satisfaction. I backed away, my heart pounding, and reached for the door, ready to leave and never look back. But as my hand touched the doorknob, it turned on its own, clicking shut with a finality that made my stomach drop. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, and I turned, pressing my back against the door as I scanned the room. The shadows seemed to close in, thick and suffocating, and then, from the darkness, the figure emerged. It was the man from drawer 47, his face pale and hollow, his eyes empty yet somehow filled with longing. His body was twisted, contorted as though he tried to rise but had been frozen mid-motion. And in the dim light, I could see something I hadn't noticed before, a faint, unnatural smile stretched across his face, as if he were pleased to see me. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice filled with a dark promise. I pressed myself against the door, my mind racing, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill seep into my bones, a cold that cut through me like ice. "Stay." His voice echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts, drowning out my fear, my reason, everything but the overwhelming compulsion to obey. I took a step forward, drawn toward him, my body moving on its own, as though something else were guiding me. As I drew closer, the figure reached out, his hand stretching toward me, cold and skeletal. I wanted to scream, to pull away, but I was trapped, caught in his gaze, bound by his will. "Stay." The word reverberated through me, a command I couldn't resist. And as his hand touched my shoulder, a shock of cold flooded my body, paralyzing me. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in around the edges, and in that moment, I felt it, a presence, a weight settling over me, filling every inch of my mind. I wasn't alone. Something else had taken root inside me, something cold and ancient, a darkness that pressed down on my thoughts, smothering them until I could barely remember who I was. As the shadows closed in, I heard one final whisper, a voice that was both my own and something far darker, a voice that promised I would never escape. "Now, you're mine." The lights flickered, casting the room into darkness, and when they came back on, I was alone. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, they found me sitting at the desk, pale and silent, my eyes distant and empty. I didn't remember much of what happened after the figure had reached out, only a vague sense of darkness, of being watched, of something lurking just beneath the surface. I left the job soon after, unable to bear the thought of returning to the morgue. But no matter where I went, I could still feel it, the weight of a presence that clung to me like a shadow, a whisper that echoed in the back of my mind, soft and insistent. "Stay with me."